All right, we're going to start talking about conditional statements today. A conditional statement is any statement that has the word, the conjunction if in it. Now, caveat before we dive into this, these are kind of hard. So we're going to be spending the next 6 days really talking about conditional statements and how they function. And all I want to work on today is talking about how they function in English with a brief introduction to what that might mean in Latin. So let's first of all talk about different kinds of conditional statements. So, conditions can tell us a couple different things. First, there's a type of condition that we call simple conditions, which indicate factual occurrences. A good way of thinking of these logically is if X is true, then Y occurs. So an example, if it is raining, I will bring an umbrella. If X is true, if it is raining, then Y. Then I will bring an umbrella. Now, important thing to note, I don't know whether or not X is true. That's the point of the condition. I don't know if it's raining outside or not, but if it is raining, then I will bring an umbrella. So the if clause doesn't actually have to be occurring. That's not what that matters. It's if that clause is true, then Y will occur. It's the relationship between the two clauses that is a fact. We'll talk more about that in a second as we look into how that relates to these other types of clauses. So now we have a kind of condition. We have a simple condition. And these simple conditions can occur at different times. Now, if we think broadly at how Latin treats time, you have 6 tenses, but when we look at participles and we look at infinitives, we see that Latin really simplifies how it approaches time into 3 big parts, right? Participles have present participles, past perfect participles, and future participles. So Latin is treating time in 3 big distinct areas. You have present, past, and future. And conditions are going to function exactly the same way. So we have simple conditions, and we can have simple conditions in the present, simple conditions in the past, and simple conditions that occur in the future. So here's an example of each of these, and we can start paying attention to this. If X is true, then Y. So if it is raining, I am getting wet. If X is true, Y is happening right now. Right? I'm standing at the door. I don't know if it's raining outside, but if it is raining, I'm about to walk out into that rain without an umbrella and I'm just going to get wet. Simple past. If it rained, the car got rinsed off. I don't know if it rained or not, but if it did, my muddy car might have been washed off a little bit. That's great. And finally, this future idea. If it is raining, I will bring an umbrella. Now, this is a good time to loop back around to some of what we've seen before with doom clauses, for example, and cum temporal clauses. In English, when we have this main clause that's in the future, I will bring an umbrella, the subordinate clause very often is just in the present, if it is raining. Right? I will bring an umbrella if it is raining. Notice that the relationship between present tense and future tense. That's a very English way of conceiving the two ideas. Notice, I don't know if it's raining or not, but if X is true, then I will have an umbrella with me. So once again, to reiterate, these conditions are called simple because they indicate facts. Y will occur if X is fulfilled because they indicate factual information. In Latin, we're going to use indicative tenses for each of these different kinds of conditions. Now, there's a second type of conditions that are not factual. In fact, we call them contrafactual conditions because rather than if X is true, then Y, contrafactual conditions show if X had occurred, excuse me, but did not, then Y would have happened. Notice, if something had occurred, if this had happened, then Y would be true, but it didn't ever happen in the first place, or is unlikely to happen in the future, therefore it's not a factual condition. I might have wished it were true in the past, but that doesn't mean it would be true. in the future. So let's talk about some examples of this. Remember, if X had occurred, then Y would have happened. If I had brought an umbrella, I would not have gotten wet. But I didn't bring an umbrella, so I did get wet. Just like simple conditions, these can occur in the present, the past, and the future. Now, English is kind of difficult. It uses really specific words to mark out subjunctive uses. And so this is where I like to really point out, because very often in modern colloquial English, we're dropping some of these subjunctive words, but I think it's important to note that English has them, even if we don't use them as often anymore. So I like this example from Fiddler on the Roof, if you're familiar with the musical. If I were a rich man, I would build staircases going nowhere. Notice, if I were, but I'm not in the present, I would do this thing. So notice that those in the present were and would. If we make it past tense, we get that example we've already seen. If I had brought an umbrella in the past, I would not have gotten wet. So notice once again that main clause has would in it to indicate a subjunctive use. And then finally we get this future contrafactual condition. If I should go to Rome, I would make sure I saw the Forum. Now, present contrafactual and past contrafactual very clearly say if this has happened or is happening, I would do this, but it didn't. Future is a little different. It just says if I should go to Rome, I would make sure I saw the Forum. It just says this is very unlikely that it will happen, right? As opposed to a simple future, if I go to Rome, I will make sure I see the Forum, which has much more intentionality. Like, this is something that might actually occur, and I'll actually do this. If I should go to Rome, maybe in the realm of possibility, I would do this, but it's very unlikely. So future is a little different there. We'll talk more about it as we continue to go through conditions. In Latin, since these if clauses indicate hypotheticals that did not happen or are unlikely to happen, in Latin these clauses will take subjunctives. So let's look at a chart and give us a better idea of what's going on here. Alright, so notice types of conditions. We have simple conditions, which just indicate this factual if X then Y, and we have contrafactual conditions, things that did not happen or are unlikely to happen in the future. So once again, like I talked about, you split these up into 3 different periods of time. You have simple present, simple past, and simple future, which we should note here tends to be called the future more vivid. It's a future that is more likely to happen. And then contrafactual conditions, we have present contrary to fact, past contrary to fact, and once again, future contrary to fact we tend to call the future less vivid. It is a future tense that is unlikely to happen. And why do we have these weird names for future conditions? Because future actions already indicate some degree of hypothetical action that we don't know. And so instead of just presenting these as contrary to fact or factual, we have to admit they're hypotheticals. So grammar people made up these terms: future more vivid, more likely to happen; future less vivid, less likely to happen, because the future, who knows what will happen. So just get used to the terminology. If you put simple future or future contrary to fact, everyone will know what you're talking about. Someone will just say, well, we tend to call that this. So, reminder, translating these or seeing them in English: simple present, just simple present tenses. If it is, I am. Simple past can be, once again, any past indicative tenses. If it was, I was, or I had been. If it has been, I had been, right? Any simple indicative past can fit into that sentence. And finally, future, as we saw: if it is, I will be. And I sadly have it is. Sorry about the typo. If it is, I will be. Alright, contrafactual conditions. These are a little harder. Notice if we look at the main clause, I would be, I would have been, or I would be again, we can get a sense of how this works in English. So all the main clauses are going to have the word would in it, and then we get those slightly more difficult English markers as a subjunctive in the if clause. If it were, I would be in the present. If it had been, I would have been in the past. And in the future, if it should be, I would be. Apparently I have a very hard time typing if today. Don't know why that is. Alright, so once again, keys to identifying conditions in English. First, figure out when the action happened. Is it past, present, or future? That's not very hard. Next, as soon as you've said, okay, I know this is past, present, or future, excuse me again, look for the word would inside the main clause. Because that word would, that auxiliary verb, marks every type of contrafactual clause. So we know it is a contrafactual condition when you have would in the main clause. So look for that. That'll tell you, is it simple? Is it contrafactual? And that tells you everything you need to do to identify right there. Right? Identify when the action occurred, present, past, or future. Is it contrafactual? Does it have would? And then we can say, okay, I know it has would, it's in the past, past contrafactual. It has would, it's in the future, future less vivid. It doesn't have would and is in the future, future more vivid. So it gives you a really quick way of figuring out in English how to look through these. Next, just something you can pay attention to. If it is a contrafactual clause, once again, pay attention to those auxiliary verbs because they mark English subjunctives. So once again, present, if I were, past, if I had been, future, if I should do this thing, I would be happy, as an example. Were, had, should. And once again, this is just something to kind of practice. A lot of times, once you've identified the main clause and know whether or not it's contrafactual and have the time, it'll just naturally translate in a way into English, and you might not use these subjunctive markers, but I just want to make sure you're aware of how English technically, I should say, used to function, because English is changing and we're dropping the subjunctive, but I think it's interesting to pay attention to when you're trying to pay attention to how subjunctives work in Latin. Alright, really quick again. The great thing about conditions in Latin, just as a quick overview, is that both parts of the condition, both the if clause and the main clause, will have the same tense in normal Latin conditions. The same tense and mood. So for example, simple present, it will use the present indicative in both clauses. And you'll just translate it like an indicative. If it is, then Y is, right? Simple past, same thing. Latin tenses, any past indicative. If it was, Y was. Notice how easy simple conditions are. You're just going to translate them like you already do. Finally, future more vivid. We'll have future indicative in both clauses. You can think of it will be / will be, but remember in English often we just say if it is, Y will be. But once again, if you keep them both as will, I'm going to not really mark any off. Just know that they're both occurring in the future, which is why I put will in both of these. Alright, contrafactual ones. Once again, contrafactual is going to always be marked by would. One thing we have to pay attention to in Latin is there is no future subjunctive. So I like talking about this by starting with the future because we have to think of what Latin tense is closest in time to the future. And the closest Latin tense we have in time to the future is the present. So in future less vivid, we have to use the present subjunctive. Notice future more vivid uses a future indicative, but we don't have a future subjunctive, so we have to shift all of our tenses just a little bit. So future less vivid uses a present subjunctive. If I should be, I would be. If we jump up here to present contrary to fact, we can't use the present subjunctive. It's already been taken over by the future less vivid, so we have to use the tense that comes closest to the present. And imperfect can be this continuing thing that comes all the way up to the present, and so we're going to use the imperfect subjunctive in present contrary to fact. Once again, if X were, then Y would be. And finally, past contrary to fact, we're going to use the pluperfect subjunctive. I just remember the word had here to remember that we're using the pluperfect instead of the perfect.